Where does humor come from? How does it work? Why is it so much harder to make a good joke than to make a bad one? And what, after all, accounts for the goodness of a good joke or the badness of a bad joke? Plainly, these are not simple questions, and we should not expect simple answers to them. But at least we are not alone in asking these questions. In fact, many deep thinkers in the Western tradition of philosophy have attempted to explain the distinguishing mechanisms of humor. Over the last 2.5 millennia, 3 theories of humor have proven especially tenacious and productive. They are generally classified as follows. First, the superiority theory. Second, the incongruity theory. And third, the relief theory. Now, we don't have time to address all of these 3 theories in a single assembly, so today I will simply explore some aspects of the superiority theory and hope to discuss the other 2 theories another time. Now, the superiority theory is the oldest of the 3. Versions of it appear as early as the dialogues of Plato, the treatises of Aristotle, and it recurs in many subsequent thinkers influenced by them. The notion receives a famous formulation in Aristotle's Poetics. According to Aristotle, comedy is an imitation of people who are worse than the average. Their badness, however, is not of every kind. The ridiculous, rather, is a species of that which is ugly, and it may be defined as a mistake or unseemliness that is not painful or destructive. The comic mask, for example, is unseemly and distorted, but does not cause pain. Consider the balance that Aristotle is trying to strike here. We laugh at people who seem to be worse than us in some way, but the form their inferiority takes mustn't strike us as disturbing or noxious. A mildly foolish person seems funny to us.
Anne's my doctor, and she's the most beautiful nurse in the world.
Come on.
Oh, God, now I'm hot. Now it's really hot in here.
Okay, well, that's your fever.
Leslie, I typed your symptoms into the thing up here, and it says you could have network connectivity problems.
According to Aristotle, by contrast, a person whose folly is really dangerous or pernicious simply cannot qualify as an appropriate object of laughter. From another angle, let's say, an accidentally stubbed toe might generate comedy. An accidental homicide, less so. In a similar vein, Aristotle's student Theophrastus wrote a book called Ethical Characteristics. This book appeals to the reader through its cheerful sketching of around 30 distinct comic characteristics, which serve to define certain recognizable comic types. These include idle chatter, obsequiousness, boorishness, grouchiness, bad taste, petty ambition, arrogance, fraudulence, slander, lack of generosity, and so forth. Now, perhaps you have already noticed from this partial list that these particular types, however diverse in other ways, conform neatly to Aristotle's requirement that comedy represent people who are worse than average, but whose badness causes no significant harm.
How are we going to get the star on top?
I got it.
That a generic murderer is morally inferior to a generic non-murderous person is not a fact of which comedy can make much use. Indeed, we encounter much the same line of reasoning about comedy in some remarks by the Roman orator and statesman Cicero. For instance, we find Cicero saying in his handbook on the orator, quote, The seat and province of the laughable, so to speak, lies in a kind of offensiveness and deformity. For the sayings that are laughed at the most are those which refer to something offensive in an inoffensive manner. But very careful consideration should be given to how far the orator should carry laughter. For neither a great vice, such as that of crime, nor great misery is a subject for ridicule and laughter. People want criminals attacked with more forceful weapons than ridicule, and do not like the miserable to be derided unless perhaps they are insolent. End quote. Perhaps Cicero is attempting to strike the same balance as Aristotle in the Poetics, and Theophrastus in his ethical characteristics. Ironically, Cicero's argument is strengthened by his own personal inability to follow this sage advice he here puts forth. We read in an ancient biographical notice, namely Plutarch's Life of Cicero, that, quote, Cicero's readiness to indulge in jokes and pleasantries was thought to be an appropriate characteristic for a lawyer, but he carried it to excess. He aggrieved many people, and he acquired a reputation for malice. Or again, and more seriously, quote, Cicero's use of very bitter jokes against enemies or legal adversaries seems to be part of the public speaker's business, but his indiscriminate attacks, just for the sake of getting a laugh, mobilized a great hatred against him. End quote. A further irony is added by the fact that Aristotle had warned against exactly this excessive desire for social prominence. In his Nicomachean Ethics, for example, Aristotle remarks that, quote, people who carry humor to excess are considered vulgar buffoons. The buffoon, however, cannot resist any temptation to be funny, and says things that no cultivated man would say, and some of which he would not even listen to. Still, what neither Aristotle nor Plutarch can adequately account for is the likelihood that Cicero's both successful use and self-destructive abuse of humor stemmed from the same source. He was not a buffoon, as Aristotle might have been tempted to call him. Instead, he was consumed by what Greeks called philotimia, love of honor, love of notoriety. In a word, love of a sense of superiority. Which brings us, at last, to perhaps the most extreme statement of the superiority theory of humor, which appears in Thomas Hobbes' 17th century treatise Leviathan. Now we have heard already from Aristotle and Cicero that comedy is the province of the grotesque, and for his part Hobbes takes this perspective to the extreme. Says he, quote, sudden glory is the passion which makes those grimaces called laughter, and it is caused either by some sudden act of their own, that is, of people, generally speaking, that pleases them, or by the apprehension of some deformed thing in another, by comparison whereof they suddenly applaud themselves. End quote. Certain of the hallmarks of the superiority theory will by now strike us as familiar. First, the assertion of another's inferiority, the presence of, quote, some deformed thing in another. Second, a fuller notion of what such superiority actually feels like, and why, therefore, it is so attractive. This rush of sudden glory that Hobbes describes, and the indulgence of people's self-aggrandizing desire to, as he says, applaud themselves. This may be psychologically acute observation on Hobbes's part, but notice as well a significant subtraction from the old Aristotelian model. For whereas ancient philosophers insisted that the humor-producing deformity cannot be one which inflicts serious damage, Hobbes silently dispenses with that particular criterion, so crucial for Aristotle and Cicero, and so destructive for Cicero when he continually failed to acknowledge it. Instead, Hobbes jettisons without comment any and all such potentially civilizing, humanizing qualifications for his theory. The potential for damage just doesn't figure in his reckoning, no more than does the potential magnitude of that damage. Unlike the laughter espoused by Aristotle, Theophrastus, and Cicero, and like the laughter that Aristotle cautions against, and Plutarch faults Cicero for failing to avoid, nothing hinders Hobbesian laughter from degenerating into a sneering, snarling misanthropy. We might even claim that the impetus to cruelty is essential to Hobbes' conception of laughter. After all, how could suddenly experienced glory at another person's abjection fail to contain an element of cruelty? All this makes for an ugly picture. Certainly, the superiority theory of humor contains much that is true. As Aristotle, Theophrastus, and Cicero construe humor, it necessarily involves a developed sense of social norms, as well as an awareness of the loss of social status involved in being seen to transgress or fail to conform to those norms. Hence the relevance of the superiority theory in helping to explain, for example, run-of-the-mill playground-style mockery. For isn't the point of such mockery simultaneously to diminish its victim and to exalt its perpetrator, thus positing a de facto social hierarchy? If nothing else, in this regard it seems fair to say that evidence for the superiority theory of humor can be found just about everywhere. For example, from Cicero's reliance on Aristotle, we might infer that, by the last days of the Roman Republic, nearly 300 years after Aristotle's death, the distinctively Aristotelian approach to humor had acquired a very widespread currency. Perhaps this was becoming something like the standard view of the structure, as well as the appropriate social and political role of humor. That the superiority theory can help us to clarify some of the features of our experience of humor does not in the end seem open to doubt. And yet many thinkers have recoiled from this image of humor's function in human society. And so one alternative has since become known as the incongruity theory, and it can boast some very distinguished advocates, chief among them the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. But that is a story for another assembly. In the meantime, I leave you with two wishes. First, that you have a lovely day filled with laughter. And second, that your laughter today and hereafter belongs more to the humane and moderate Aristotelian variety, rather than the self-aggrandizing and hostile Hobbesian sort.